As a field rooted in radical behaviorism, the goal of organizational behavior management is to use behavior change techniques in the workplace. One of those behavior change techniques that we'll be covering today is punishment. Skilled researchers in OBM have designed effective punishment procedures to reduce behaviors targeted for change. Let's look at some of those now. As we all know, parking at a university is one of the most aversive contingencies a student can contact. Every lot is always full, nothing is free, and the lot you pay hundreds of dollars a semester for is 1,000 miles away from class. Clever or bold students often choose to take shortcuts and risk parking in restricted lots to avoid having to park so far away or to buy a parking pass. The fines for parking in a restricted lot vary, but at one Midwestern public university in 2020, the parking citation was $45 per offense. OBM researchers decided to see if they could find a better way. Their goal was to reduce the percentage of illegally parked vehicles. In this particular parking lot, there were 199 spaces, some designated blue parking areas, the rest yellow parking areas. Clayton and their team came up with the following intervention. Randomly, twice a week, they would walk the parking lot and search for illegally parked cars. If they were required to park in a yellow space, but parked in a blue space, they would place a sticky note on the car that said, "Be careful, you've parked in a blue tag area. We care, so mind the signs. Yellow tag parking is further back." The behavior analysis team. Meanwhile, campus parking security maintained their normal patrol and citations. Using this procedure, Clayton and colleagues saw a drop in percentage of illegally parked cars from a baseline 14.5% to a treatment condition percentage of 3.9%. Now, is this really a punishment study, you might ask? Isn't a $45 fine more aversive than a sticky note with a nice reminder to park elsewhere? Well, yes. I think most would agree that a fine is more aversive than a sticky note, but let's look at the contingency. A consequence was presented that reduced the target's behavior. By definition, this is a positive punishment contingency. Clayton goes on to argue that the feedback in the form of punishment also worked to establish instructional control over the behavior, leading to the students to park in the appropriate spots in the future. Let's take a look at a more direct use of punishment in the form of incentive and penalty. The target for behavior change in this study was correctly performing the task of welding. As we all know, welding is a very dangerous activity. Partly for this reason, the researchers used a computer training program designed to simulate welding. Part of the intervention involved a safety criterion that was dictated to the participants as 7 safety rules. Rule number 1, you must wear gloves. Rule number 2, you must wear arm protectors. Rule number 3, after each of your 4 iron plates are correctly placed, you must clean them with a brush. Rule number 4, you must wear a protective mask. Rule number 5, hold the bottom of the welder. Rule number 6, completely cover the gaps between iron plates. Rule number 7, clean everything up. There were actually 2 experiments in this study that involved different incentive and penalty conditions. For experiment 1, the incentive condition involved a base pay of 5,000 won plus an extra 50 won for each correct welding task. The penalty condition included a base pay of 10,000 won, but a penalty of 50 won for each incorrect welding task. For experiment 2, the groups began with the same base pay, but were placed on a FR5 schedule, which paid 250 won to those in the incentive group for each 5 correct welding tasks, and penalized 250 won for each 5 incorrect in the penalty condition. In experiment 1, penalty and incentive had about the same effect. But for experiment 2, incentives seemed to have the edge on performance, suggesting that the positive procedures are more effective in producing safe work performance outcomes than punishment procedures, even when the base pays are adjusted to make the outcomes more equitable for both groups. The 2 studies above raised ethical concerns and tried to address them in their methods. In the Clayton study on illegal parking, they recognized the aversive control used by campus parking security and designed a less aversive punishment procedure that turned out to be more effective. Lee and Oa manipulated the base pay in both conditions to make incentive more reinforcing and penalty less aversive. Practitioners of OBM have a very difficult time designing straightforward behavioral interventions. For starters, there are internal company rules as well as government sanctions that determine ways in which you can and cannot arrange the environment. Second, in a workplace, there is always a lot going on. Organizations are full of people, and one thing that all people do is behave. We never stop behaving. The workplace as a social environment is almost always changing, and OBM practitioners have little chance of getting anywhere close to the level of experimental control normally seen in more clinical ABA settings. But we can't just throw up our hands and ignore the science of behavior. Let's take a look at a punishment study in a healthcare clinic that has more serious ethical concerns because they were not informed by a science of behavior. Medical doctor Luke Larkin and his colleagues conducted this study in an urban emergency department. Their target for behavior change was getting their staff to comply with domestic violence screening protocols. In order to measure adherence to these protocols, they created a 4-tiered progression of disciplinary action. For the first offense of noncompliance, staff were given verbal counseling and discussion about the effects of noncompliance, as well as a review of the screening policy. For the second offense, the consequence was more counseling and a written warning. For the third offense, they received a last strike, where it was put in writing that the next offense would mean the staff member would be fired. For the fourth offense, the staff member was fired. While they got good results, any competent behavior analyst would see ethical issues with this intervention. There was no analysis of the contingencies maintaining their original noncompliance or a discussion of outcomes that would end with a person losing their livelihood.